child everywhere.
Good morning and welcome back to Grit and Grace, a literacy journey. We are so excited because today's episode is one that we are incredibly honored to bring to you. My co-host this morning, my daughter Gretchen, could not be with us for a very special reason because she's on maternity leave right now, enjoying her brand new baby boy. So congratulations to her. But we're so excited because I am joined today by the one, the only Dr. Reid Lyon. He is a nationally recognized leader in literacy. And honestly, listeners, he's one of the most influential voices behind what we now call in education, the science of reading. But for decades, Dr. Lyon's been at the center of this work, helping lead that research, including his work with the National Reading Panel, which I'm sure you've probably heard of, and pushing our field always to better understand how children learn to read and why so many struggle with that. So, our conversation this morning is especially important for today's educators and leaders because what we're going to bring out is while this science is definitely not new, the urgency of it remains. So, today, he and we're going to explore what we've known for decades, but why that knowledge hasn't always translated into practice and what it will take to ensure that all students learn to read. That's our hope and our vision. So this is truly a conversation about truth, about legacy, and ultimately about what is possible for our students and our schools when we align what we know with what we do. I have had the extreme privilege recently of collaborating with Dr. Lyon on a project, and that collaboration's led to some very intense conversations, and that's led to our discussion this morning. So, Dr. Lyon, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, hi there, Angie. I'm really honored to be here with you today. You're a fantastic role model for me and leaders, and your ability to handle complexity in solving the problems we're trying to address is really inspiring for me. And congratulations to your daughter as well. But
Well, thank you.
it's great to be here, and I'm just again very excited about our conversation.
I am too. So let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start off. A lot of us know you so well, and really, we kind of see you as really the one that got a lot of this started in the field. But there are so many new educators. For those who do not know about your work, Reid, can you please take us back to the beginning and what drew you into the field of reading in the first place?
Sure. Well, actually, as a little kid, I had a tough time learning to read. It
Okay.
did not make any sense to me in the first and second grades. Uh, the curriculum or the teaching approaches used were more of your literature-based, you know, whole language approaches. But I could not understand how one looked at these squiggly lines and made sense out of them. And the schools didn't have a very good answer for that. And my mother, who had some pretty good common sense, said, well, I don't think he is understanding that you can break these words into pieces. You can segment them so that he can begin to put sound on top of them. So I'm sure she was talking about phonics. Uh, but that was the only way, beginning in the third grade, that I finally began to make sense out of something. You know, in the technical language today, I finally understood the alphabetic principle, meaning, you
Okay.
know, here
Mhm.
is this print on a page, and I can represent that by the sounds of speech. And if I mix all that together, then I can read words and then go on from there. And I became a voracious reader. But I will tell you that the experience, the shame and embarrassment I felt when struggling in front of my peers uh, really knocked me for a loop all through my schooling. I really did not like school. I didn't think I was smart. I thought the opposite. Uh, Even though I became a very good reader, and so uh, I by the end of my high school, I had no desire to go on to higher education. Plus, I couldn't because my grades were terrible. So I got a job with the U.S. Army, and there was a conflict going on, so there was a lot of work available. Uh, and I served for 15 months in a combat zone. Uh, and in doing that, I learned that I was capable of leadership. I learned that uh, I could figure out some complex kind of problem. And it had happened that several of my friends were hurt beside me overseas. And when I visited them in the hospital, they had head wounds. Uh, two of them had lost their ability to read. They could listen and speak, but they just could not. They looked like I did when I was 6 and 7. Uh, and that fascinated me because I could see, obviously, that reading has this brain base. Long story short, that interest propelled me to study the brain in detail. It took me quite a long time to specialize in neuroscience and then apply that to reading. But that's the start of it. It's a personal interest. And then it was a clinical interest when I saw that, there were these relationships between the squash and how we think and how we behave. And so with that, I went through a lot of schooling, about 12 years of schooling, and emerged as someone who uh, understood cells and molecules and brain structures and how the brain handles information. And I decided, why don't I apply that information to something like reading? I was very naive reading it. It's very complex. So
Very,
if you want to try to map
very.
how one learns to read within the brain, that's kind of an arrogant uh, foray into complexity. But be that as it may, that's how I started my career, and that took me to the National Institutes of Health. Before, uh, when I was in my training, my basic science training, and I was also studying learning and learning disorders, uh, I uh, said to myself, I don't even know what it looks like for somebody to teach a kid to read who's struggling. I don't know what that's like. And so I went and took a bunch of education courses, and I got a provisional certificate, and I went and taught the third grade as a third grade teacher.
Wow.
Now, I got in this classroom, low income school. A lot of the kids had not had the background linguistic foundation for making sense out of the printed word easily. Uh, uh, about 60% of my kids really had difficulties learning to read. Uh, the same number had difficulties or even more by the time the year was over. I really did not know what I was doing. I had no skills whatsoever. What I was looking at was the same thing I felt, the pain and anguish of reading in front of people when you're barking at the print. And so I was mortified that I could not do better than that. And while I was teaching, I asked myself 4 questions. How do children learn to read? What are the skills and the abilities and the environments and the neurobiology and the genetics and the language foundations that children need in order to pull print off a page and understand what the heck they are reading? Second question I asked, why are all my kids having difficulties, or 60% of them? Why are they struggling? Which of those skills, abilities neurobiological factors, genetic factors, home-related factors getting in the way. Here they are in the third grade with me. 60% of them couldn't read. Now I'm wondering what the heck happened in the first and second grade. So it was easy to blame those teachers. But my third question was, how do we prevent this from ever happening? How can we figure out early on who might be at risk for struggling in being able to read and comprehend what you read? And the last was, I know we couldn't prevent 100% reading difficulties. So how do you remediate it? How do you work with older kids who now have a history of struggling to learn to read within the context of their schooling? And I took those 4 questions to the National Institutes of Health. And I was recruited there because I had this dual background in neuroscience and learning disorders, because NIH was keen on trying to solve what they saw as a poverty crisis, much of which was related to inability to learn to read. That is, it's tough to find a job, it's tough to take care of yourself and so forth without the ability to acquire information through print. So it was at the National Institutes of Health, when given the responsibility to design a program, I used those same 4 questions. How do kids learn to read? Why do some kids have difficulty? How do you prevent it? What do we do about it when you can't prevent it? That is the foundation in many ways for what is called the science of reading today. And I know this will bore people, but the science had to be done extremely well. In other words, I could not ask, and the researchers could not try to understand the 4 questions unless we looked at studies that were longitudinal in nature. Kids are moving targets. And we had to be able to determine what is it early that seems to over time play a role in limited reading proficiency, whether that's lack of language structure, whether that's poor teaching, whatever it may be. To answer the 4 questions, we had to have a multidisciplinary framework. So in 44 sites around the country, there were multidisciplinary teams asking those 4 questions, composed of educators, reading teachers, neuroscientists, geneticists, sociologists, demographers, all of the specialties that one would want to study these kids as they travel along in their life, trying to understand how to read. These studies were done in such a way that findings in one site, let's say in Texas, could be replicated in Massachusetts or California. So replication of findings was critical in this research network. And a long story short is that the science of reading is something that can be somewhat confusing to people.
Yes.
And it's actually very straightforward. And let me try to explain it this way. Here we have thousands of replicated studies that help us understand, what does it take for kids to learn to read? What do they need to learn to know? What does their brain need to be able to do? Well, as we all know, they need to understand that reading is founded on the ability to place sounds onto letters and letter clusters initially. That's absolutely necessary. That's the phonics part, if you will, or the decoding part, if you will. But you're not going to even get there if you don't have very strong oral language coming to the process. Reading is parasitic on language. It is nested within language. So we always respect to the maximum the fact that reading is not this isolated skill out here, but it's part and parcel of how we have learned to listen and speak. So here we are. We've got a good idea of, okay, in the jargon of today, we know a kid needs phonological awareness. We know a kid needs that because that allows them to place phoneme sounds onto print. We know that as they map these sounds onto print, the jargon is orthographic mapping, they begin to get the words in their memory. We know that if it's taking them too long to do these gymnastics at the word level, we're not going to have the memory capability to remember what the heck we read. So we know that speed is important as one reads. We know that as one reads, one immediately has to begin to relate what they're reading to what they know, to background knowledge. We know they need to bring higher level language structures to asking themselves reasoning questions. Is this something that I can relate to? What would I predict would happen next in this story? And so forth and so on. And as kids move through these different phases of reading, the whole thing begins to shift. Kids, as they're getting the words in, now come across as they get older different vocabulary.
Yes.
More extensive vocabulary, specialized vocabulary. They now get into sentence structures that are more complex than what was experienced in early reading. They now are required to actually use reading to solve problems. So the demands change, but it is a synergistic process. Reading is like 8-cylinder car engines, actually a 16-cylinder car engine, where all cylinders have to be operating very efficiently in order for the entire engine to power the automobile. And so how do kids learn to read? That's what it takes. All right. So why do some kids have difficulties? The studies went after which of those kinds of components or elements in this multi-componential reading foundation are impeding the entire process. Is it at the word level? Is it at the speed level? Is it at the vocabulary level, background knowledge level, all of the above? And that began to compile information, those studies, which were then replicated. We then started early at 4 and 5 years of age and followed kids, and we began to understand what are the skills early on that we can see that tell us a youngster may have a tough time. How do we prevent it? Then we could go into classrooms and schools, even from the NIH, and do what you call clinical trials, where we're asking whether certain instructional approaches and their components have a higher probability of success with kids than other approaches. That way we can begin to understand, does instruction have to be direct, or can it be more student-centered knowledge building by being exposed to literature in different literacy contexts? And then we were able to begin to focus on older children in later elementary school and middle school who continued to have difficulties, and understand what is the duration of instruction needed, what is the intensity of instruction needed, and again, how much time do we need to actually engage this youngster in very clear, direct instruction? So altogether, the science of reading, for all of those of us who hear this all the time and get 1,000-yard stare, is this amalgam, this amount of replicated information that tells us how kids learn to read, why they have difficulties, what we can do to prevent it, and what we can do when we don't prevent it. Science is the operative word in the science of reading. And what that means is the information that currently occupies this barrel of facts, this big basin of information from all of these thousands of studies we did, that information is always still evolving. What we found in 2003 can be overturned by another study that comes about today. What we thought we knew in 2003 is no longer viable, and it has to be pulled out of that scientific bucket. What I have to be able to explain is that science is always democratic, not politically, just meaning that it is subject to change at all times. It changes when different scientific studies, again, conflict with the results we've had before, which happens. Not too often, but it does happen. It goes on to say that, scientists like myself are trained to always ask questions in a way that we can prove ourselves wrong. We want to prove ourselves wrong because we're all biased. I don't want to be trying to figure something out where my belief systems are, the main theme that I'm using, because I know that'll get me into trouble. So we try to overturn what we have found to make sure we're neutral, that we know that what we're finding is highly flexible in the sense that we can't hold on to it if better studies tell us in different ways that we may have not had the total answer. So that's always occurring. That's science, such that the science of reading is a body of knowledge, always evolving. The facts within the science of reading are replicated facts. You can trust them. Yes. And they bear on a lot of questions we're asking today, such as what do teachers need to know to be able to teach reading? What do leaders need to know, and in what detail to support teachers who are teaching reading? What do instructional curricula and programs require to be called evidence-based or effective or whatever it is? So every question we have, from policy to actual implementation, can be answered by the replicated information one finds in the science of reading.
I love that.
The science of reading is not a program.
Right.
It's not structured literacy. It's a body of knowledge. You can take from that body of knowledge to build programs.
Right.
But it's not the program. It's totally separate. It informs everything we do. If everything was right in the world, it would. But
it would. Absolutely. Yes.
And so just to wrap that kind of discussion up, when we talk about the science of it, it's not mysterious. It's a body of information that shows some complexity. And fortunately or unfortunately, if we learn that complexity, then we can reduce reading failure down to about 5% lack of proficiency. I mean, if we do that.
If we always say we have to embrace that science and implement it. And I'm so glad you pointed out what it is and what it is not. But thank you for that deep explanation of the science of reading and the history, because I think a lot of people in education today don't know that history. And they are now familiar with this term, the science of reading. But thank you for explaining where that came from. And I want to point out two things that you said. I want to point out when you talked about the pain, the shame, and even the anguish of what it feels like with that struggle to learn to read, because read, we still have that going on today with so many students. And I feel that's that deep reason or why of why we've got to get this right. Why we have to embrace that science and then replicate that in our schools. The other thing is those 4 questions that you thought of decades ago are still the questions that honestly should guide our work right now, that we should be talking and thinking of. So thanks for that explanation. And when you talked about the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that the NIH research found with response to different ideas about how kids should be taught to read? Can you explain that for us?
Sure. Well, in developing the research program, we had to look at all of the prevailing ideas about those 4 questions: how does
Right.
reading develop, and so forth and so on. In doing that, at that time, the prevailing approach to reading instruction and the prevailing ideas about how reading developed were that reading was similar to listening and speaking, in that it did not require direct instruction for it to evolve. As kids come into this world, they go through these phases, language phases, where they coo and they babble and they use single word speech, and then they extend that to blah, blah, blah. And mom and dad aren't sitting there with an instructional manual teaching them to do all that. It does appear to emerge naturally. The idea was reading was very, very similar, that if one exposed children to very enjoyable interactions with books, with literature, with a host of literacy activities, then that motivation and those skills necessary for reading would begin to develop somewhat on their own, with the teacher as a guide. Uh, from that particular idea that reading is natural, which we were going to study, and the longitudinal work helped with that, is all right, if kids do not need to be directly taught, how can we best help them navigate unknown words that they come across? Do we teach them how to decode those words to sound? Or do we keep them within the lovely space of the text and have them try to guess what those unknown words are from the surrounding context or from picture cues that might be on the page in early readers? Is that an effective way to do things? In studying these prevailing ideas in the early 2000s, we learned from longitudinal studies that kids do not develop the skills that are critical for reading naturally. We also learned that kids, if they're using words surrounding an unknown word or pictures to predict the pronunciation of that word, that's an extremely inefficient practice, because only 20 to 30% of words in the space the kid is looking at can be predicted.
Right.
Also, kids read every word, as do adults, on the page. They don't glance over or gloss over and search out cues to help them read a word. Like us, their eyes focus on every word and decode the letters to sound. That's what good readers do. And so, one rapid finding was that no, reading is not natural. It does not occur like listening and speaking. It is nested in language. But if you allow kids to to come across a reading material and be able to read that on their own. The majority of kids will not be able to do that. When we hear parents saying, well, my kids were reading by age 3 and they just picked it up naturally. When we go into their homes, we find those parents were teaching kids by reading to them. They were doing rhyming games. They were playing ubby dubby. They were saying, hey, say big without the book sound and stuff like that. All of that is the language or linguistic gymnastics that allows one to do the complex work of deciphering print. And long story short, this reading stuff is complex. You'll hear me use complex a lot. There's a lot to know, and there is a lot to for the reader, and there's a lot to know for the teacher and leader.
So complex. I'm so glad you pointed that out. But one of the takeaways, listeners, I hope you caught that. Reading is not natural. I love that phrase, linguistic gymnastics. I love that. I don't think I've ever heard that. And I love that. I wrote that down. But you're right, it is complex. And that's why we have to work so hard, Reid, to get it right, is because it's not easy. But since we do have, though, this trustworthy body of scientific knowledge. And so I was a teacher who, and I've shared this with you, but I was a teacher who, when I was so discouraged because I couldn't get 100%. And even though I was reaching 60%, 65%, why could I not reach all of them? And it wasn't until I met mutual friends that we have, Dr. Vicki Gibson and Dr. Jan Hasbrook, that said to me, well, 95% or even more is possible. And then I'm like, then why aren't we all doing that? And then they started talking to me about this body of research and how we do that. And so here's my question. And also this comes with part of my frustration, but since we have this trustworthy body of scientific knowledge, why has it been so difficult to implement it in states, in districts, and schools? Because it's been around so long. In my work, I say to schools all the time, this is not new. This is not myth. This is not just a slogan. That's not something that's going to go away. This is a body of scientific research. This is a body of knowledge from multiple studies that's been around now really for 50 years.
Yeah, well, what's great is you and I are working together, developing with Lori Severino at Drexel University a doctoral concentration in leadership in literacy science and systems change. That recognizes, to get to part of your question, the value of what leadership brings to the translation of this body of knowledge, this science, into what we do in schools. We have realized that, again, leaders are so fundamentally important in moving information in its entirety to their teachers while they are in their schools. But if I can go back to the root of your question, you and I took education courses.
Yes.
You and I attended programs in colleges of education. I also attended programs in science, but be that as it may, there were big differences. It has been historically that colleges of education and what we call EPPs, educator preparation programs, have different views of science, of ways of knowing. And unlike other professions that are responsible for human life, human welfare, health, education has had the luxury or been provided the luxury of not being held accountable for the information they provide to people who then are expected to navigate a classroom of children with varying difficulties in many subjects and in reading, which is our topic. Why is that? There is something called philosophical pluralism. You can forget this term, but it's a bucket term that just means that colleges of education, EPPs, are frequently beholden to the idea that there are many types of science. Mm-hmm. There are many different ways of knowing. And your science or your science of reading is just one way of knowing. Other ways are what we teach our students, whether that be through case studies, whether that be through narrative analysis, whether that be through descriptive work and so forth. What we're doing in understanding the science of reading is, does X cause Y? Now stay with me here.
I will.
We want to know if X, what we do as a leader or what we do as a teacher, causes Y, which could be changes in reading proficiency, changes in behavioral adaptability among kids. Does X cause Y? Well, to do that, you got to figure out, okay, there's a lot of stuff that comes between X and Y that also can influence Y. You know, if I'm going to study a particular type of instructional strategy and look at its impact on reading comprehension, there's all kinds of things that can also improve reading comprehension, like more reading at home, more books in the home, that kind of thing. So there's got to be a way when we do science to really try to get to the actual direct answer. If you do not do the science or do the research in ways that can account for all of these other things going on that can also cause the outcome, then we have a very impure idea of what the heck's going on. And so, again, the notion, let me take us back for a minute when we were talking about those kids who were identified as being early readers at 3 and 4. The X in this case would be they heard language. The Y is that they were actually being able to read words at 3. But if we go back, we see parents now playing games with them, linguistic gymnastic games.
Yes.
That's one of those things that can also influence their reading. So it's just not listening and being showered with books and language. It's actual direct instruction from parents that also come in the mix. So I know this sounds like I'm dancing on the head of a pin, but it's critical. If a teacher is going to be taught about an instructional program or different aspects of reading, that teacher needs to know that the program has actually been tested with the kids that she's responsible or he's responsible for and found to have the impact desired. And that impact desired is because of the program, not something else. That program actually carries the weight in helping teachers change reading behavior. So in the academy, in colleges of education, frequently, this more objective and rigorous way to understand what works and what doesn't work is typically not in play.
Right.
And it may be foreign to teachers or anyone else who is involved in education, that we actually have this information that if we have a kid who is struggling in this manner, we actually know which instructional interactions, materials, examples might be more beneficial for this youngster than others. Now, people will constantly say this is way too complicated.
Yeah.
You can't figure this stuff out. You know, what you have to understand is that the research you're talking about, the science of reading and direct instruction, are just code words for phonics. That you just want to keep, piling on this phonics belief system. Phonics, to be very clear, is one extremely important part of reading instruction, but it is by all means not sufficient.
Right. Just one. It's one
It's
part.
one of many,
One.
many, and we can name
Yes.
all of the other componential complexities that have to be understood by the kid, and that's obviously understood by the teacher. So when you ask, why is it so hard to be implemented? Why? Because we know all of this, don't we move it into practice? It is because those doing the moving do not understand, have not been provided with the information that some things work better than others, that some things are not indicated in this case. If reading is not natural, why would one want to place children within a context where that philosophy is guiding the instruction? It's just not the case. So what we do know is that reading requires a very deep understanding on the part of the child of how, when they see an array of printed material, they go to that material and use a set of capabilities to bring it into their brain. And those sets of capabilities go way beyond phonics.
Right.
And the only way to basically get the raw data in is to understand what that word says, and you can bring it in. But word reading is not reading. Word reading is not comprehension. Word reading is a gateway, is an off-ramp into the beauty of the narrative that we then can comprehend and learn from.
Word reading is a gateway. I love that. You have identified the importance of common knowledge and common language across leaders and teachers and improving reading proficiency in the country. This is one of the things that you and I have talked quite a bit about, actually, and agree on. Why is this so important, this common knowledge and this common language across leaders?
Well,
Because it doesn't exist. So
right.
why is it so important?
Yeah, and it's related to what we just talked about. Keep in mind that professions that are responsible, and I'm repeating myself, for human welfare,
Right.
for the viability of people's lives, for their ability to make a living, for their ability to maintain health, and so many other things. Professions that are responsible for those outcomes have a set of evidentiary standards: medicine, engineering, speech and language pathology, physical therapy, audiology. All of those professions ascribe to a body of knowledge, their own
Right.
science of reading.
Yes.
Those standards of evidence, while people may disagree, always have to be applied, because to move outside those standards of evidence we are, in a sense, producing malpractice. If we know something is for the benefit of the human being and we do not follow the evidence, the rules of evidence, in applying that, then we're off the reservation, if you will. We're now
Yep.
entering a world of belief systems, I
Yes.
believe. The way these different professions handle standards of evidence and how it's applied to their profession in their interactions with human beings is through a common knowledge of what it takes to learn something, to develop something. Let me give you an example. If I'm a speech and language pathologist and I have a youngster in front of me who's having difficulty learning vocabulary, I have to know why that is. Why that is founded in the evidence. I'll go to my evidence bin and say, why is it that kids have a tough time learning to understand vocabulary? And of course, it gets much more specific. But then they go into that bin and say, if the youngster is having this kind of difficulty, what can I do about that? And then the evidence says when youngsters are presenting or having this particular issue, this is the way we want to be able to help that youngster navigate it. That professional can then, if unsure about what they may be saying, what they may be reading, can go to another professional, another speech and language pathologist, and say, look, I've got a youngster who's having a really tough time with verb tenses. And I see that the literature is saying this is why and this is what I may be able to do, but I'm just still unclear. Can you help me with that? That individual has a common language with the teacher that's working on this. And without that common language, we're talking about so many different things with different words. There is no problem-solving capability whatsoever. Angie, I'm not being very articulate here.
I think you are. I think you are.
Okay. Well, maybe you can use some of that, but let me get a drink here.
Okay. I want you said the word malpractice.
Yeah.
And you also said without the science, we enter a world of belief systems,
Yes.
which is so true.
Right.
And I shared with you, I had taught in the classroom for 10 years, desperately seeking information. And I had taught 10 years. I still find this just astounding. 10 years before I even knew there was a science. There was science behind what it was that I was doing in the class.
Yeah.
Thank God that I met Vicki Gibson and she
Right.
started saying the science. And I could not believe that I'd gone through all this preparation. Then I entered a master's into administration and still didn't get the science. And it was people that brought it to me. It was great consultants, that brought it to me outside of those educational preparation programs. So thank you for expanding on that. I think you did a brilliant job of it. Well, listeners, this has been such a powerful and meaningful conversation with Dr. Reid Lyon. And as you have just heard today, the research behind how children learn to read is not new. And yet, the urgency to act on that knowledge has never been greater. This work matters. It matters every day. It matters for every student in every classroom every single day. And we're just getting started. So, in our next episode, we're going to continue this conversation with Dr. Reid Lyon, and we're going to take a deeper look at what it truly takes to move from knowing to doing, from just knowing the science, from just knowing it to implementing it. So we hope you will join us. As always, thank you for listening to Grit and Grace, a literacy journey. And as you know, it takes both grit and grace, and it definitely is a journey that we are on together. So thank you for listening. As always, this podcast has been brought to you by Angela Hanlin and Associates.
Grit and grace, that's how we grow. Step by step and child by child we know. There's power in the words we say. We lift the voices like the way. Grit and grace, it's a journey we all share. For every child, everywhere.